We begin tonight with a stunning discovery deep beneath the ocean waves. Divers have
What appears to be a
On January 28, 1986, the world watched in disbelief as the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart just moments after launch. 7 astronauts lost their lives in front of millions of viewers. But what really became of the crew after the disaster? The answer is both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. Here's the full story. A launch the entire nation was watching. The morning of January the 28th, 1986, felt historic from the very beginning. At Cape Canaveral, the air was freezing. The sky was crystal clear, and excitement filled the launch site. Families bundled up in jackets filled the viewing stands, waving small American flags, while reporters prepared for what was expected to be another proud moment in American space history. This mission, known as STS-51L, was different from all the others. On board was schoolteacher Christa McAuliffe, chosen through NASA's Teacher in Space program. Unlike the professional astronauts beside her, she represented ordinary Americans, which made the mission feel personal to millions watching from home. The crew also included Commander Francis Scobee, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnik, and Ronald McNair, along with payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. Together, they symbolized courage, discovery, and the future of space exploration. But hidden beneath the excitement was a serious danger. Temperatures overnight had dropped lower than any previous shuttle launch. Ice covered parts of the launch structure, and several engineers had warned NASA about the freezing conditions. Their concern focused on the rubber O-ring seals inside the right solid rocket booster. In extreme cold, the rings could stiffen and fail to seal properly. Despite those warnings, the launch moved forward. At 11:38 a.m., the countdown reached 0. Engines roared to life as clouds of steam rolled across the launch pad. Challenger slowly lifted into the bright Florida sky, while cheers erupted from the crowd below. For 73 seconds, everything appeared normal. Then suddenly, disaster struck. A massive fireball tore through the shuttle high above the Atlantic Ocean. 2 white trails spiraled away from the explosion as shocked spectators stared upward in confusion. Across America, teachers and students watching live struggled to understand what they had just seen. The shuttle never emerged from the smoke. Confusion turned into horror. In the first moments after the explosion, many people did not immediately realize the shuttle had been destroyed. From a distance, the expanding cloud looked almost unreal. Some parents at the launch site even reassured children that it might simply be part of the mission. Inside Mission Control, however, panic and confusion spread quickly. Telemetry signals vanished. Data screens froze. Flight controllers desperately searched for answers while maintaining professional composure. Then came the chilling realization that Challenger was gone. Television broadcasts replayed the explosion repeatedly, while stunned news anchors struggled to find words. NASA officials quickly ended public briefings and retreated behind closed doors. Meanwhile, a massive search operation was already beginning in the Atlantic. The U.S. Coast Guard, Navy, and Air Force rushed ships and helicopters toward the debris field. Rescue crews scanned the ocean for any signs of survivors or floating wreckage. Divers prepared for one of the most difficult recovery missions in modern history. Before long, pieces of Challenger began appearing in the water: scorched metal, insulation, broken wiring, and fragments of the shuttle's exterior. But beneath the surface, sonar equipment soon located something far larger resting on the ocean floor. A discovery that would become central to the investigation and recovery effort, the recovery operation. As the days passed, the mission shifted completely from rescue to recovery. The Atlantic Ocean became the focus of an enormous joint operation involving NASA, the military, and hundreds of specialists. Ships searched mile after mile of ocean, while divers descended into dark, freezing waters to locate debris from the destroyed shuttle. The task was emotionally devastating. Every recovered fragment told part of the story of what had happened during those final seconds. Investigators eventually determined that the disaster began with the failure of an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. Hot gases escaped, igniting the external fuel tank and causing the shuttle to break apart in mid-air. The tragedy permanently changed NASA and remains one of the most painful moments in the history of space exploration. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Atlantic Ocean became the center of an enormous recovery effort unlike anything NASA had faced before. Ships, aircraft, underwater technology, and hundreds of specialists were brought together with one objective: not rescue, but rebuilding the story of what happened. The waters off the Florida coast were relatively shallow, around 100 feet deep in many areas, but that actually complicated the mission. Instead of sinking into one isolated location, Challenger's wreckage had spread across a massive stretch of seabed, creating vast fields of twisted debris. Sonar vessels continuously scanned the ocean floor, sending pulses through the water and receiving strange echoes in return. Some signals turned out to be tiny fragments. Others revealed major sections of the shuttle. Every contact had to be inspected carefully by divers or remotely operated equipment. At first, recovery crews focused on debris floating at the surface. Coast Guard teams collected shattered insulation tiles, torn sections of metal, broken tubing, pieces of the payload bay doors, and fragments from the external tank. Each item was catalogued, photographed, and preserved as evidence. Above them, Navy helicopters mapped the drifting debris field from the air, but the majority of Challenger remained hidden beneath the waves. Navy divers repeatedly descended into dark, freezing water where visibility was often only a few feet. Guided by fluorescent markers and tracking lines, they moved through an underwater landscape filled with mangled beams, engine parts, wiring, and broken structural components. Some fragments were tiny, others were massive enough to require cranes for recovery. As wreckage was lifted from the ocean, it was transported to a large, secured hangar at Kennedy Space Center. There, investigators created a reconstruction area where recovered pieces were arranged on steel frames shaped like the shuttle itself. Bit by bit, Challenger was rebuilt so engineers could study every crack, burn mark, and fracture pattern. Each damaged section held another clue. By early February, thousands of pieces had already been recovered from the Atlantic. In total, crews eventually retrieved more than 100 tons of debris, nearly half the shuttle's original weight. Yet one critical piece was still missing. The crew cabin had not been located. Then, weeks later, sonar operators discovered something resting quietly on the seafloor that immediately drew attention: the discovery of the crew cabin. On March 7, 1986, more than a month after the explosion, a Navy sonar sweep detected a large object buried partially beneath the sand about 18 miles east of Cape Canaveral. The object appeared different from every other discovery made so far. It was unusually large, relatively intact, and far heavier than typical debris from the boosters or fuel tank. Divers were sent down immediately. As they descended into the cold darkness, their lights slowly revealed the outline of the wreckage. The moment they saw it, many already understood what they had found. It was the crew compartment. For weeks, some investigators had quietly suspected the cabin might have survived the initial breakup in one piece. Now that fear was confirmed. Although the structure was badly crushed and torn apart in several places, enough remained for immediate identification. The windows had shattered. Metal walls were bent inward. The frame itself was twisted beyond recognition. But there was no doubt this had been the section where the astronauts spent their final moments. When the cabin was finally lifted from the ocean, the atmosphere aboard the recovery ship became completely silent. NASA officials and Navy personnel stood quietly as the wreckage was secured on deck. There were no celebrations, only grief and respect. The cabin was transported under heavy security back to Kennedy Space Center, where investigators began a detailed examination inside a restricted hangar. Their findings revealed a chilling sequence of events. Evidence showed that the crew compartment had separated from the shuttle largely intact during the breakup. Instead of instantly disintegrating, it continued traveling upward, eventually reaching nearly 65,000 feet before beginning a long descent toward the Atlantic Ocean. The fall lasted roughly 2 minutes and 45 seconds. When the cabin finally struck the water at over 200 miles per hour, the impact forces were catastrophic. Inside the wreckage, investigators uncovered evidence that helped piece together the astronauts' final moments, details that remained deeply painful for everyone involved. Recovering the crew. Once the crew cabin was opened inside the secure facility at Kennedy Space Center, the mission became far more personal for those involved. Engineers and investigators were no longer focused solely on mechanical failure. They were now dealing with the remains of 7 people who had dedicated their lives to exploration and discovery. The mood inside the hangar changed immediately. Conversations became quieter. Every action was carried out with extreme care and respect. Within the damaged cabin, recovery teams located what NASA publicly referred to only as crew remains. Out of respect for the families, the agency never released graphic details. However, officials later acknowledged that the recovery process was emotionally devastating and extremely delicate. Weeks underwater had severely damaged the interior. Saltwater exposure, pressure, and the violent forces involved in the accident made identification incredibly difficult. Even so, specialists worked patiently and carefully to ensure that every crew member could eventually be returned to their loved ones with dignity. The identification process was painfully difficult. Recovery teams followed strict military-style procedures throughout the operation. Every fragment was carefully photographed, labeled, and documented. Personal belongings recovered from the wreckage were separated for forensic review. The remains were then transported to a secure facility believed to have been located at Patrick Air Force Base, where medical examiners, forensic experts, and pathologists began the long and emotional process of identification. The operation was carried out entirely in private. No cameras were allowed, and NASA kept every detail tightly protected out of respect for the astronauts and their families. Because this was 1986, modern DNA testing was not yet commonly available. Investigators instead relied on dental records, skeletal analysis, and personal effects to identify the crew members. In some cases, remains could be connected to specific individuals. In others, separation was impossible. One by one, the identifications were confirmed, and families were quietly informed. According to official Navy reports, all 7 astronauts had been positively identified by April 19, 1986. Investigators also uncovered evidence that raised deeply troubling questions about the crew's final moments. Some emergency oxygen systems appear to have been activated after the shuttle broke apart. This suggested that at least a few crew members may have remained conscious or briefly regained awareness during the fall. NASA's later biomedical analysis stated that the exact moment of death could never be determined with certainty. However, the final impact with the Atlantic Ocean was unquestionably unsurvivable. Once the identification process was complete, families were given the option to privately bury their loved ones. Any remains that could not be individually separated were cremated together. On May 20, 1986, during a quiet ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, the combined ashes of the Challenger crew were laid to rest beneath a simple memorial. But even after the funerals ended, another question still haunted the country. How could a single failure destroy a spacecraft the public believed was nearly indestructible? The investigation that changed NASA forever. As recovery operations came to a close, attention turned toward discovering exactly why Challenger had been lost. President Ronald Reagan established a special investigative panel known as the Rogers Commission, led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission included some of the most respected figures in aerospace history, including astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride. Their mission was not only to determine what caused the explosion, but also to uncover every mistake that allowed it to happen. The investigation quickly focused on the right solid rocket booster. Engineers discovered that the disaster began at a joint connecting two sections of the booster. The joint relied on rubber O-rings designed to seal gaps and prevent hot gases from escaping during launch. But the weather on launch morning had been dangerously cold. Temperatures had dropped far below conditions seen during earlier shuttle missions, causing the rubber O-rings to become stiff and less flexible. Instead of sealing instantly when the booster ignited, the rings responded too slowly. Video footage captured a small burst of black smoke seconds after liftoff, the first sign the seal had failed. As Challenger climbed higher, superheated gases burned through the weakened joint. At 73 seconds into flight, flames pierced the external fuel tank, triggering the catastrophic breakup of the shuttle. But the Rogers Commission uncovered something even more disturbing than the technical failure itself. Investigators learned that engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the boosters, had warned NASA the night before launch about the danger posed by the freezing temperatures. Several engineers strongly recommended delaying the mission, arguing that the O-rings had never been tested under such extreme conditions. Despite those warnings, the launch was approved. The Commission's final report sharply criticized NASA's management culture, citing communication failures, poor decision-making, and weak safety oversight. It called for major reforms, including redesigned booster joints, stricter launch procedures, and stronger independent safety reviews. As a result, the shuttle program was suspended for more than 2 years, while engineers implemented sweeping changes. Inside NASA, the impact was enormous. Challenger was no longer viewed as simply a technical accident. It became a symbol of how ignored warnings and organizational pressure could lead to tragedy. Engineers who once felt unable to challenge leadership were now encouraged to speak openly about safety concerns. When Space Shuttle Discovery finally returned the shuttle fleet to flight in 1988, the mission began with a tribute to the 7 astronauts lost aboard Challenger. Challenger's lasting legacy. After the investigation concluded, NASA faced one final responsibility: preserving what remained of Challenger. Inside a secure facility at Kennedy Space Center, engineers completed a large-scale reconstruction using recovered shuttle debris mounted onto steel frameworks. The display was never intended for public viewing. Instead, it served as a permanent lesson for investigators and future aerospace engineers. Access to the recovered wreckage remained heavily restricted. For the astronauts' families, however, the focus was remembrance rather than investigation. Those remains that could be individually identified were returned privately to loved ones. The portions that could not be separated were buried together at Arlington National Cemetery, following the wishes of the families. The memorial ceremony was small, quiet, and deeply personal. There were no television cameras or large crowds, only grieving families, fellow astronauts, and NASA officials honoring 7 lives lost in the pursuit of exploration. In the years that followed, Challenger permanently changed the shuttle program. NASA redesigned booster systems with improved seals and heating mechanisms to prevent cold weather failures. Safety procedures became stricter, and engineers were given greater authority to raise concerns without fear of being ignored. When Discovery launched again in 1988, ending NASA's long suspension of shuttle flights, the memory of Challenger was present in every moment. Before liftoff, the names of the 7 fallen astronauts were read aloud, followed by a long moment of silence that reminded the entire nation what had been lost. Inside Mission Control, a heavy silence filled the room before future shuttle launches. The memory of Challenger never left NASA. Every astronaut who traveled to space afterward carried the legacy of those 7 crew members with them. Across the United States, Christa McAuliffe continued to inspire students long after the tragedy. The lessons she had planned to teach from orbit were eventually shared with classrooms nationwide, turning an unfinished mission into a lasting educational legacy. Although the Teacher in Space program was never launched again, its purpose survived through new educational initiatives created in her memory. At Kennedy Space Center, the Space Mirror Memorial was updated to honor the Challenger crew. Their names, carved into the memorial, continue to catch the sunlight year after year as a tribute to their sacrifice. Every January 28th, NASA employees quietly gather to remember them. The ceremony is simple, emotional, and deeply personal. The names of the crew are read aloud one by one, followed by a moment of silence. Some of the divers, engineers, and recovery workers who witnessed the aftermath in the Atlantic have returned for these memorials, still carrying memories of what they experienced decades earlier. The remaining wreckage of Challenger is still stored in a secure NASA facility today. It is preserved not as a symbol of defeat, but as a permanent reminder of the lessons learned from that tragic day. Silent and hidden from public view, the remains continue to stand as a warning about the cost of ignored risks and the importance of accountability. More than anything, the story of January 28, 1986, endures because of the people aboard Challenger: explorers, scientists, teachers, and dreamers who believed in pushing humanity forward. What are your thoughts on the Challenger disaster and the impact it left on space exploration? Let us know in the comments below.